Okay. Thank you, Colonel. And thank you all for inviting me here. It's an honor and a pleasure. Let me start by telling you a little bit about the situation at the beginning of World War II. We had just come through a Great Depression of the country all over the world, probably. And the situation was that Nazi Germany at that time had conquered all of Europe, including France and all of North Africa, along with their buddy Mussolini in Italy. Their armies were knocking at the door of Moscow in the center, and Stalingrad in the south, and Leningrad in the north. Japan had taken over all of the South Pacific, was occupying China, and certainly all of Singapore, and they were threatening Australia. So things were pretty bleak at that time. And so when Pearl Harbor came along, everybody got real serious, and in fact, everybody was thinking about the war and what part that they should be having in it, and everybody doing their part. In fact, at that time, I was in the infantry with the 31st Division, the National Guard unit that we were already recalled to active duty, which I was in my senior year in high school, and we were mobilized in November. And I remember the first time that I was on leave from Camp Blanding, Florida, that I, like most all of us, were anxious to get home and get out of the uniform and just enjoy civilian life for a few days. But when I was walking down the street of my little town there of Northport, which is a suburb of Tuscaloosa, I had a couple of instances where the guys, the elderly people, turns out that most of them were World War I veterans, but they asked me, they said, "Well, hey, what are you doing, son? Where are you these days?" And I had to very quickly say, "Mr. Anders, I'm in the National Guard. You remember we were mobilized, and I'm down in Blanding, Camp Blanding, Florida." "Oh yeah, okay. Well, that's great. Good, son. Come on, I'll buy you a cup of coffee." And that happened 2 or 3 more times at that time and later on. So thereafter, I kept my uniform on when I walked around town and just kept it off. So that was an indication of the attitude about the war. Colonel has told you about my situation that brought me to a bombing mission on the Ford plant, Ford and General Motors plant at Antwerp, Belgium. And we had just dropped our bombs and on our way back when our flight, our group, was already under fairly hard and heavy siege from the flak that was shooting up from the ground. But then the German fighters jumped us, and we were able to do pretty good because the B-17, which was known as the Flying Fortress, had a lot of firepower. So, but our plane had a situation where one engine was on fire, and that finally blew part of the some of us were able to bail out. And I was picked up actually out of the channel by some German sailors. And from there on, my main story is my experience in the prisoner of war camp started at that time, and I was transferred back and forth to 2 or 3 different places, and ended up at a place in Germany, in the eastern part of Germany, known as Stalag Luft 3. And we'll have the first slide. Well, that's showing approximately where it is. And okay, this one right here, we'll go. That shows the layout of the camp. And I want to say to you that we were in probably one of the best camps for POWs in Germany. But we had 3 things working for us. We were Americans, which was an advantage. We were Air Force, or Air Corps at that time, because our people ran that camp was the Luftwaffe, the Air Force of Germany. Certain amount of camaraderie even between enemies if you're in the same service and all, because I wasn't in the hands of the German Navy for a while, and I could tell the difference when I was taken over by the Luftwaffe. And thirdly, we were officers. So we were in the ideal situation, if you can call it, if there is such a thing as a prisoner of war. But for that reason too, I have no horror stories to tell you about what happened in the camps, because they pretty much followed the restrictions about prisoners of war as specified in the Geneva Convention. But anyway, I ended up here at Stalag Luft 3, and that is one of the compounds. The Stalag Luft 3 was divided into a number of compounds, and those 3 of them were mostly all Americans, and one of them was a British compound. The barracks and the buildings and so forth were all just the cheapest type of building, but reasonably livable. And let's go to the next. This is a little closer up of the layout of the buildings. We go to the next one. And there's a better layout of our compound. If you'll notice that low rows of barracks and do I have a corner? I don't know. Okay. In the upper part of that is a sort of a field, a playing field, there. And all around that, if you'll notice, it's barbed wire fences with the towers, the guard towers in it. And those were double row fences, and then a bunch of barbed wire between the fences. And the barracks, each one of them were well organized. They had a barracks, head of the barracks, and then each room had sort of a leader. So it was well organized, and that was very helpful for the life of a prisoner of war. We go to the next one. That shows a closer up of the building. That's just one of the barracks with the top taken off of it. And you can see that there's a hallway down the center and rooms over the right and left. And there was part of one of those rooms was a kind of a kitchen, and one of them was a shower room. Okay, next one. This is the interior of one of the rooms, and incidentally, I want to point out to you that some of these pictures, and I'll comment about them, are very authentic. That is an actual picture of the room, which shows there the bunks in the background, and that was at some point along the line of our prison life, because it started off there was only 2 bunks, but as we continued to get an inflow of prisoners of war, primarily, of course, there from the Air Corps, and most all of them were bomber crews. But anyway, that shows you there that, and that was home for almost a couple of years for a number of us, and they continued to get crowded more and more, and they shortened the distance between those bunks and put another bunk on top where I think we ended up with 4, maybe 5, where you could just get into your bunk. And in that room there was a little stove that was pretty good when you had fuel to put in it and all. The German word for prisoner of war is Kriegsgefangening, so we call ourselves Kriegies. And just tell you a little bit about the normal day life of a Kriegie. Much of the time, as I say, was spent in that room. The Germans had just 2 or 3 demands on us, and one of them was we had to line up twice a day, once in the morning and the afternoon, to be counted. Now, if you go to the next slide. This is just showing some pictures of the lineup to be counted, and that was somewhat of a kind of a formal get-together and during the day. Out on those fields, the top part of that, you can see some details of that open field that you saw back in the thing. And that's where we lined up and to be counted, because as you can imagine that was quite essential for the Germans to keep a tally on prisoners, to know that if anybody has escaped or not. Well, that was one of our, anyone that's in the military probably knows that if you are a prisoner of war, that it's your duty to do whatever you can to try to escape. Not only just to get out of there yourself, but also to keep the enemies busy trying to find escaped prisoners, which they don't like to have running around the country. One of the techniques then was to see if any way that you could mess up the count. Because if you could have someone that was escaped, and the longer the Germans didn't know that there was an escape, it was better for that person to get further and further away from the prison camps and more toward civilian areas, and working his way toward primarily from there work his way through Germany and to get into Spain, or to get out north into Denmark and get out by the sea. One of the techniques then was to not line up straight so that the Germans, we stand up in rows of 4 so the Germans could go down and count them, is to not line up exactly so you couldn't get a good count. And every minute that you could stall that count, the better it was for your escapees or those that had gotten out. Well, that worked for a while until the Germans said, where they were just insisting if it lined up. And I suppose they probably pulled some stunts with our commander, which was a full colonel at that time. Later on, it was a brigadier general. That there was a lot of wisdom in cooperating with the Germans in such things as the count and other ways, because that would allow the colonel to trade with them on other situations that we had. One time we did not line up, because this was a situation where we really had to give these guys a time to get out, because I think there was 2 out of our camp our compound escaped. So we stalled, and finally the Germans gave up, we thought, but they left with their little squad of guys with their rifles and all, and told us to stay on the field. 30 minutes later, they come by with practically a platoon of soldiers and all with about 30 machine guns, and set them up. And I guess the German commandant asked the colonel, "Are you going to line up and be counted?" And they say that the colonel said, "Well, in that case, we'll line up." So that's what happened as one of the incidents on the field. But the daily life, other than lining up twice to be counted, was centered around making, for many of us, making good use of the time, because it could be quite boring and all if you couldn't find something worthwhile to do. Well, there was plenty to do if you availed yourself to it, because we received quite a lot of athletic equipment and allowed us to play baseball. We had to play softball because the field wasn't that big. And we had guys that were musically inclined. We did acquire some musical instruments, and that was one thing. We did have quite a lot of books that was sent in primarily by the Salvation Army. And so you had textbooks for anything that you might want to study. Then there was always, of course, decks of cards to play, and many of the guys spent a lot of their time playing cards, pokers. We had guys that were real good at playing bridge, and those guys seemed like they played all day long and into the night. So we often thought that, boy, after this war is over, is that the United States is going to have some real sharp bridge players, because they were serious at it. But those were some of the things that we were doing to keep busy and to better ourselves. In fact, the British had some arrangements where their people could earn college credits while they were in prisoner of war camp, and many of those took care. So they had classes, and we had classes too of some of our guys, because in the camp of that many people, you have all sorts of capabilities and backgrounds and so forth. So we had a number of people were qualified to conduct classes, and many of us took advantage of that. And we also had, let's see, let's go to the next slide. Okay, this shows the library. We converted one of those rooms, and that's how we got crowded in some other rooms, but we did that and were able to have this area as a library. We had the guys that staffed that, and they were all experts, librarians. One of them had a degree in the library science, and so they were able to code those books and so forth and help us out. I am in one of those pictures, the center picture, I believe, standing back in the background. It was, as I indicated there, it was always crowded, and taking out books to take them back to the barracks to study and read, and you could get into discussions with others that were interested in the same subject. But the primary occupation for many of us was doing what we could to support escapes. Let's see, let's go to the next. Okay, this is the primary focus of the escapes, of course, is to dig tunnels to get out of there. And I believe that this is a drawing of the tunnel that was in the British compound, which is the one where the Great Escape took place. The idea there was to find an opening that could not be found easily by the Germans to start the tunnels. And you had to go down, I think we went down 20 feet before we started going out toward the fence. And most all of the activity was from the barracks near the fences, obviously cut down the distance that you had to dig. But I think this one indicates that the unique thing about the tunnel that the Great Escape took place was that it was not near the fence, it was way back, so that 2/3 of the time that, or better, maybe 3/4 of the time that we were digging was still behind barbed wire. Well, as you might imagine, what is the biggest problem when you're digging tunnels to escape? Well, the big problem is, what do you do with the dirt? Well, you couldn't certainly pile it up outside or do anything that would give the Germans an indication that you were digging tunnels, although they knew that we probably were digging tunnels. So they had guys that we call ferrets. These were guys that guards. Actually, they were just guys in coveralls. They weren't armed. In there with a long instrument like a long screwdriver, poking holes in the ground underneath those barracks, trying to find out if we were digging any tunnels. I think eventually they realized we would not have tunnels close to the ground, but it would be down low. But that's one of the ways they tried to detect them. And so the dirt was brought out and up through the shaft and taken by crews to spread it out someplace outside so that it couldn't be detected too much. Well, you can't carry that around with a sack on your back or a box that you're carrying, because the ferrets would immediately don't know what you were doing. In fact, it was so important that, as I understand it, that they had an arrangement that if you could figure out a way to get rid of the dirt, that you would be not the first one, but I think the third one to go out. And from there on, if they accepted your way of disposing of the dirt, from there on you didn't have to do any more work, but you would have that third place in going out. One way, and probably the most successful way that somebody won their place in the line, was to take some old trousers that we had, and you cut the legs off of them and fix it so that you could, down at the bottom of it, around the cuff, to kind of string in there a cord or a piece of wire so that you could enclose that leg. That would be two of them. And at the top of that, you would have an opening where, with a rope around it, so that you could hang it over your neck and cover those legs with a coat, which in that time, in that part of the country, and most of the time you could have an excuse for having some kind of coat. You would hang that, they would fill those legs with dirt and hang them over your shoulder with your coat on. Then you could walk outside without being noticed. And you would walk to some different areas where you were, and this was highly organized and showed exactly where to go. And at the right signal, you or somebody else could pull the cord on the bottom of those two legs, and you could shake them and shake, and the dirt would come out. And there would be someone there to spread the dirt out. In fact, one of the ways is that we, during the summer or any time practically during the year, we sometimes have to fake it, that we would have gardens out there, although some of them did have good gardens. But that was another way to go where the garden was, and you could drop the dirt there, and it could be spread around and all by somebody, one of the guys in the gardening. That worked okay, and they never did detect that. So that was a good one. Well, we had another couple of projects in there. One of them was a ditch digging project to do drainage, and we were able to dispose of a lot of the dirt there. Now, want to get you inside of a tunnel. Just a minute, I think we've got the next one. Yeah, that's showing that the shaft, it goes down, as you notice, and at the bottom of the shaft you have to have a kind of an area to assemble your dirt, and then just the area where guys can switch around and head out toward that tunnel to do their digging. Okay, let's see what the next one shows. All right, this shows a couple of pieces of equipment we have. The one on the right is a a ventilator. We had to have air in those tunnels. And what that was made there so that then it has bellows in it, and you could pump that back and forth, and it would produce some air going down through the tunnel. We also had lights in there because the barracks were lit with this not real lit up, but had lights. So some of our guys who were among their group, there was 2 or 3 journeyman electricians, so that they were able to rig up the lighting down in there. And the one on the left shows the guy operating into leverage there to pump that back and forth to pump air into the tunnel. And you have to visualize that in a camp like that, which ended up with probably at least 10,000 people, all the various abilities and so forth, that there was a few that was almost experts at almost anything. And like that ventilation, they had it figured out so that they could ventilate that tunnel regardless of how long it got to be. Well, now here is a guy, this of course is outside, showing this as a demonstration. The tunnels were lined with 3 foot by boards, which they were bed boards from our bunks. All those bunks had just straw mattresses, but the mattresses were held in there by these slats or boards that you see an idea about the size of that. So as time went on and the tunnels were increasing out in distance, they were commandeering, our guys were commandeering more of our bed slats, so got to some point where you can imagine there wasn't enough to hold you up, but innovation again. Got the idea of making ropes out of anything we could and burn holes in the boards at the sides of those bunks and run ropes across and put your mattress on those ropes, which turned out to be more comfortable anyway than the bed boards. This, let's go back to that other one. So you see, you're having to work on since that thing was 3 foot by 3 foot, the tunnel was, you had to work down on your stomach or side, whatever. But that little and it's a track there made out of some boards, and this little trolley is made out of some boards, but the wheels are made out of wood, but lined on the outside with some tin that was from one of the food parcels that we got that had powdered milk in it, called Clem at that time. That's milk spelled backwards. But the line those so that you would have some good wear on them to push those carts back and forth up to the head of the tunnel, load it up, and load up the boxes or load them up different ways, and move, then take that back. Although you could have just a long rope that somebody could pull it back to that spot that we saw back in one of the pictures where I was showing you where you had a kind of a big area to assemble that and to have a place to store the dirt. Okay, let's go to the next one then. This shows a picture, I think it's from one of the movies, I believe. It shows kind of how it is, a cramped condition in there of digging those tunnels and getting the dirt out and up the shaft into the bags that were taking it out in the yards and spreading it around. Quite an engineering undertaking it was. Let's see, let's go to the next one then. Well, at some point in this time at Stalag Luft 3 there in Sagen, Germany, the war was moving along pretty good, and the Russians were now moving toward Germany, and moving pretty fast because the Germans lost a lot in that first winter of their war in Russia, and so they were moving pretty fast. So the Germans decided that they needed to evacuate that prisoner of war camp at Stalag Luft 3, because they still had hopes that they were going to continue to fight the war, and they didn't like the idea of probably now about 10 to 20,000, maybe higher than that, experienced fighter and bomber pilots all of a sudden being liberated out of Germany, which are just going to come back to Germany in a bomber or a fighter. So they went to some trouble to keep us locked up. So this shows, in fact, it was I believe it's January, last of January, maybe early February, I forget the exact, of 1945, that one of the, as you can imagine there, the snow and all, one of the coldest nights of the year, they announced, gave us 30 minutes to pack up and move out. Well, we were pretty well ready because we knew that it was going to happen at some point, so we kind of had our stuff all arranged. And so, but here we're moving out and taking our stuff in any way we can on our back, and also the little sleds that we put together real quick with as much of our stuff as we could carry, and started moving out toward southern Germany. And we were marching most of the time, but then the time they put us in boxcars, we had to stand up and all, and that was for almost a day or a night. But it was part of the routine and all that you had to have to comply with that one strong instinct to survive. And that attitude, I think, served us all well, because then that's the attitude you have to have. We had a few people that kind of gave up, but I don't know what happened to them, but so we moved on and ended up down in a place called Moosburg, Germany. That maybe next slide, please. Well, we were in that camp for a couple of months, and we knew things were getting near the end because we were not permitted to have radios, but again, innovation and skill allowed us to have radios all the time. but it was just only one or two, I think primarily what they call crystal radios. It was enough to get the broadcast from BBC in London, which they broadcasted all the time. Later, I understand that the reason they had to be broadcasting all the time, that helped the underground people in like France to be able to do some of their communications things. But we knew about where they were all the time, and we knew when the invasion came and so forth, and the progress is being made as the troops moved across Europe. But finally, we were liberated, and we were liberated by General Patton's army. And one of these pictures, or a couple of them, show General Patton up on one of his tanks and making one of his little short talks, one of them, which I guess you guys are glad to see me, which always got a nice applause. And we were there for a while, but some of us were so wire crazy, I guess, that we didn't want to stay around, so we took off and freed ourselves and took off to other parts of Germany near the camp. And we were there for a few days, but after a while we had to reassemble and get loaded up to start the process of getting back home to America. Let's see the next one. Well, this is what we saw when the fences were being torn down, and this is the raising the Stars and Stripes over the town of Moosburg, Germany. And of course, you can imagine that was a wonderful sight to see, to tell us that we were now back in the custody of the United States. And I recall standing there looking at that flag, and it was a good feeling, but one that has sort of stuck with me over the years, that remembering that and what that flag means to a lot of people and what it means to me. Those impressions you never forget. Well, as I say, we were, started the processing us out. One of the main things it did was delouse us, because I guess we had to go through some kind of cleansing. So did that, and we ended up in a place in near Paris, France, a huge place to assemble the prisoners of war and divide them into groups of where they were going to end up in the States, at the nearest military bases to their homes in the States. And we were cleaned up and got good uniforms and so forth, and put on ships and shipped back to the States, and ended up in New York Harbor. Well, that was the story of 22 months of my life, which is one of those kind of experiences you wouldn't take $1 million for it, but wouldn't take 10, 100, maybe millions to go through it again. Although I will say that compared to what some of the others, and certainly to our friends in Japan area, that we did have it pretty good. And to end up in New York Harbor, seeing the Statue of Liberty was another reminder that we had gone through it all for a very good purpose. And I thank you for listening.